Tim Hodger was a fine mountaineer with notable ascents here in the Canadian Rockies, on the Squamish Chief, down in Yosemite Valley, and also in the Himalaya. But it was really as a mountain rescue warden that he made his mark. Over a 30-year career, Tim performed hundreds, if not thousands, of rescues and helped many people in trouble, saving many lives, and is lovingly remembered by many of us across Canada. I recorded this interview with Tim in his home here in Canmore on December 2nd, 1996. Tim spoke for 2 hours and told me some fabulous stories, but unfortunately, we only got up to the early 70s, and that was it. I planned to come back and record the rest of his story, but I never got around to it. But I do have this interview, and it's a real gem.
I was born in Toronto. My father was in the newspaper business, and we moved to Winnipeg when I was about 5 years old, which would be in around 1951, just after the Winnipeg flood. And as a youngster, I can remember climbing the furniture, and we lived in a 2-story stucco house, and I had to climb the walls of the outside walls of the house too. And I can remember trying to shinny up the drain pipes for lack of anything else good to do, and being frustrated at the young age of 6 or 7 by the fact that the trees in Winnipeg are not made for climbing. They're not for kids. Elm trees and oak trees do not make good climbing trees. So I climbed the power pole in the back alley, and I climbed on the roof of the garage, from which you could see the Golden Boy on top of the Manitoba legislature far across the city. And I can remember going on a road trip to across North and South Dakota and across the northern states, over to Idaho and up to Banff. And I remember very well stopping beside the highway where there were huge dirt banks, and just like letting a dog out of the back seat of the car, I was out and across the road and across the ditch and up the ridge of some nameless dirt bank, because it was just in the genes.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents transferred from Winnipeg to Vancouver in about 1957 or 58, when my father moved from the Winnipeg Tribune to the Vancouver province. And I can remember the move. I was actually left for half of a school year in a boarding school, and then at the end of the school year, I followed my parents out to Vancouver, and to my pleasure, or to my amazement, the front yard of our house in Vancouver on 29th Avenue contained the perfect climbing tree. And pretty shortly I was in the top branches and looking at the mountains of the North Shore. My mother was always an avid sportswoman, but also an avid library user. She came home with 4 or 5 fat books every week. And I remember in about 1957 or 58, I must have exhibited enough of an interest in climbing or mountains or something that my mother, I should say, brought home a rather amazing library book, and it was The White Spider, the history of the Auger. So my first formal input into the stories of mountaineering was the story of the Auger. and I'm sure I've often said it. You know, she didn't know what she was doing when she did this, because the stories, of course, are about real climbing, and they just plucked an immediate chord in me, and I knew that this was what real climbing was about. Was not hill hiking and not flower sniffing. It was things that were comparable to Knight's challenging adventure, and so I must have made some noise about doing things like this, to the point that my father had a friend who, Harry Green, my dad talked to him and told him of his son's interest in mountains, and fairly shortly after that I was invited to accompany a guy who happened to work for my dad at the province, but was also a member of the Alpine Club, and they were going to go on a climb, and I was welcome to go with them one Saturday afternoon or Saturday, and it turned out it was an ascent of Mount Seymour in North Vancouver, and of course Mount Seymour is a ski area, and there was a road close to the top, and you get out and park in a parking lot, and the climb to the top of Mount Seymour is really a hike along a well-built, well-constructed trail past some faint excuses for rock bluffs, which are covered with really pretty mosses and lichens and so on. But this was not really what I had in mind. I mean, I was polite enough to enjoy the day, but it didn't quite cut it somehow, and I can't remember how it came to be, but I was still interested enough that I was put in touch with a chap named Paul Wisnicki, who was the climbing chairman of the Alpine Club section in Vancouver, and I was again invited to go out and do a day with Paul and his family, and it was his daughter Nina and his son Michael Wisnicki, and I found myself on my first highway trip to Squamish with the Wisnickis, and where we were going, when we got out of the car and I looked up, I went, oh, this is it. This is the real thing. There is rock here. And we spent the day exploring, I can't remember which it was, the north or the south gully, which was something of a deal in those days, but you had to use your hands, and you had to climb steep stuff. And of course it was, as usual, drizzling wet, and I can remember more about the smells of oranges and grapefruits, that we had for lunch, sitting in some drippy spot in one of the north gullies. But I realized that this was the real thing. So that was how I came to hear about Squamish, and this was, I'm not sure of my timing, but this was around the time that, I think it was shortly after I'd gone out there with these folks, that Jim Baldwin and Ed Cooper took on and did the first ascent of the face of the Chief. People who lived in Vancouver at the time will remember that that their antics on the face of the Squamish Chief became kind of a cause célèbre at the time, and because they sieged the climb. It was really an early wall climb. It was happening at the same time that people were just beginning to tackle the big walls in Yosemite, and I'm sure in Ed Cooper's mind he was right up there, setting the pace as far as climbing granite walls and so on. The climb on their climb on the Chief took a total of 28 climbing days, And they stretched this over a period of a couple of months. And so many people were coming out on the weekends, so many tourists were coming out because the thing received a little bit of coverage at first in the Vancouver papers, that people were coming out to look and see what these crazies were doing. And they were selling enough cups of coffee and Squamish and maybe hamburgers that Squamish began to realize that this wasn't a bad deal. And these guys, when they wandered, like a couple of scruffs that they were, into Squamish, instead of being rejected, people were buying them coffee and eventually buying them meals, I think. And when they needed a little bit of help because they were running out of hardware, they talked to one of the welders or one of the, whatever you call it, the blacksmiths in Squamish, and somebody knocked them up a set of steel bongs that they would need for the large cracks that they were coming up against when they got up to the split pillar. Of course, the Walden and Cooper were bolting, and they climbed a blank slab, and the bolts that they were putting in, people would be interested to know, a lot of them were 1/8-inch bolts. They're about the size of nails, of fat nails, when they were put in. They would put in so many of these, and then they would put in like a 1/4-inch raw which is appropriate for granite, raw stud bolts. But anyway, they made it to the split pillar, where they came into a big crack system, and the split pillar is in fact a giant exfoliating flake which will fall off of the Chief someday. And the crack behind it starts out at 1 inch or 2, and it goes up, I can't remember, but it goes up 100 feet and gradually gets wider and wider. And as you get higher in the thing, I mean, they ran out of the size of pegs that were even made in those days. They were using hickory blocks with gold line cord through them and hammering those in. And they were hammering them in with a sledgehammer to make sure that they would hold. And much to their chagrin, the pins at the bottom of the pillar were falling out behind them as they were driving in the pins at the top of the pillar, which was a pretty exotic story at the time, even though there weren't too many people paying attention to the details. And as I say, it took them 28 days. I went out there, or was driven out once or twice, I think, to have a look. I remember seeing it in the paper and being captivated by this and thinking, well, this is where climbing is at. And in fact, it might be part of the reason why I was drawn towards what became known as the sport of wall climbing fairly early on. I mean, we climbed it at Murin Park, the rocks above Murin Park, and we climbed on in the gullies and so on. And of course, we climbed on the slabs on the apron at Squamish, and became proficient. And it was a big deal when, for me anyway, it was a big deal, and my friends, when we finally got up the snake route, which nowadays would probably be just a standard route and a nice afternoon's trip. I mean, it didn't take us that long, but it felt good to get up something, and you climbed them with your hands, and you climbed them with technique. And I can remember some of the climbers in those days at Squamish. A few names that come to mind: Bob Woodsworth. These guys were excellent, very concentrated and very together slab climbers, standing on small holds and so on, and running things out. And of course, the climbing boots of the day were not high friction rubber boots. They were Austrian rock climbing shoes with thin soles, but they had a little Vibram sole to them. The one that I always had for 10 years was a model called the Spider. I can't remember where it came from. But in any case, a few of us began to sort of turn our attention to taking on the longer, steeper climbs. Now, that's not to say that there hadn't been a few done, and a few years at least, at my age it would have seemed like a long time before I was there. There were people like Les McDonald had done some climbing, and Les was legendary there. and he was a Brit who had done some of the corner routes off to the right of the wall of the Chief, and there was no doubt that they were sort of beyond our reach. But we were fascinated with the toys, with the equipment of technical climbing, and it seemed to separate us from the mountaineers of the day. You know, it seemed to be something that was a little different, and we wanted to make our mark, I suppose. And so we would collect hardware from. I mean, you had to borrow it from a number of people in order to get enough to do a pitch of 8 climbing, really. Anyway, somewhere in there, I can't remember the exact year, but probably around 63 or so, 64, a couple of my friends and I decided that maybe we might just take a run at trying to do the second ascent of the Grand Wall. And Jim Sinclair, who was always out at Squamish on the weekends too, and was a little bit older than the rest of us, and he was the connection. Jim had known and befriended Baldwin and Cooper very closely, and he had photographs. I remember Ed Cooper, of course, still is a photographer, and Jim Baldwin had black and white photographs of the first ascent, which were just like prizes to look at. We made some preparations to take a run at the Chief, at the face of the Chief, and we had enough, I don't know, sense to realize that this was going to be a reasonably big undertaking. And so what we did was we decided strategically we would haul equipment out to the dance platform, and it would be there like a bait for us to arrive at. And it really doesn't show that we knew much about where we were going, but it's interesting that we put together that there was this thin little ledge that traversed across the steep part of the face, and that this might provide an access out there. So we went up and explored it, and we found it. And this is the ledge that is now known as the Bellygood Ledge, which the name of which was just a play on a Chinese accent saying very good. And Mike Wisnicki used to say, "Oh, it's belly good." And when we were crawling across the ledge, we did get down on our hands and knees because it's a horizontal dike, so there's a little slot in the face, and you're crawling across it like a tiny tunnel with one side missing, and really missing because there's at least 600 or 700 feet of air there. And we bagged up a bunch of junk, including some cans of food and stuff, and put them into a duffel bag and shoved it across this ledge and put it out there with the intention of climbing the wall and reaching it and bivouacking on the ledge and carrying on. And one thing led to another, and my friend Mike and I didn't end up doing it. We actually went back and retrieved the pack and brought it back off there because we felt badly about leaving litter there. And but a few weeks later, someone else came up to me. It was Dan Tate, and Dan Tate said, "I heard you were interested in climbing the Grand Wall." And I said, "Well, sort of was." And he said, "Well, I'd be interested in it too." And that was all that it took. And about a week later, off we went up the Grand Wall, and it didn't stop us. I mean, we had hooked a few bolts before, and we'd stood in a few stirrups. We climbed the sentry box over at Mirren Park, and we put some nails in some of the roots on the papoose. But this was just basically going out. And as we took off, we were basically, because of the photographs that we had seen of Baldwin and Cooper taken by Ed Cooper, we were basically sort of miniature or youthful mirror images of those two guys. We wore Swami belts that were pieces of car seatbelt webbing wrapped around the waist 3 or 4 times and tied off with a fisherman's knot, and our climbing rope was tied to that. But on the back of that was another sling tied to it, and maybe 6 feet down on the end of this sling was like a green army canvas duffel bag which was our haul sack with the stuff in it. So the person who was leading the pitch, of course, wouldn't wear one of these things, but he'd climb up the bolt ladder and construct some kind of a station, and then pull up a rucksack dragging it up the slab, and then the second would come up, and he would climb the bolts and clean the junk off the bolts and the slings, and take the nuts and the hangers off as we went by there. You literally put the hangers on. I mean, that was part of the climb. And made it up to the split pillar, and then climbed the split pillar. And I remember now, as I speak, that we had borrowed some of the original steel bongs from Jim Sinclair. He kept them as souvenirs, and we borrowed them and used them again. They were huge things. They weighed about 4 pounds each, and you could get a few decent steel pins at the time, up from some are coming from Europe, and some of the smaller angles, like the Army angles and stuff like that, out of the States. But I think we were just beginning to get some of the hardware that was coming out of California. And we reached the top of the split pillar, and it was late enough in the day, because we were so incredibly slow, of course, that we bivouacked on the top of the split pillar, which is a ledge that wouldn't be as wide as this table, and probably about 2 bums wide. And so the deal was to hang some stirrups from a crack a little bit higher up over the edge and put your feet in the stirrups. And we had taken one sleeping bag that zipped wide open, and it was the inner to something. It was a lightweight sleeping bag. It was in the summertime. And we hung this thing up over top of both of us and spent the night there with our tin cans of peaches, cranking open the lid and eating these delicious peaches, and then throwing the cans off and being amazed at how long it took them to hit and clunk on down this into the darkness and stuff. But I can really remember sitting on this ledge, which was, of course, no great achievement at all, but at the time I'd never done anything like it, and my feet were in stirrups, and I realized that I was doing what I had dreamt about already. And this is my version of the swallow's nest or something like that. You actually had to sleep sitting up. In fact, I remember really distinctly sitting there thinking, well, you sit awake all night. I'd somehow gathered the idea from the White Spider that you never slept on a climb, that it was too terrifying, or that you just, I mean, if you sat up you couldn't sleep. And so I'm sitting there just yakking away to Dan Tate, like I am now, really excited about being where I am and wanting to just soak it up and compare experiences and just get more out of it. And Dan Tate in the darkness is sort of going like this, and he's gone off to sleep. And I suddenly realized, wait a second, you can't go to sleep. You don't sleep on bivouacs, but I suppose maybe you do. So I sort of put my head on his shoulder, and we passed out and had a pretty pleasant little night sitting there. But it was a pretty neat experience for a couple of kids. I think we were, 16, 17, something like that. And we carried on the next day, and one of the things that we had done is we had totally underestimated the amount of water that was required. I mean, we had 1 or 2 water bottles, and we thought that was pretty exotic. I mean, we knew it was heavy. Well, I mean, we were dry, pretty dry by the next day, and we managed to get up this thing. I mean, you sort of hoped that the bolt ladders would continue, and of course, there's no reason why they wouldn't, but we just didn't know what we were going to find, and it wasn't all bolting. There was a bit of free climbing. I recall the top 15 feet at least of the split pillar. We led it like a jam crack, a squeeze jam, and then we climbed some free climbing above that up to the point where you were going to leave these flakes and go out on the face again, and there was a bolt ladder there where I understand now somebody's put in like a fixed rope for the free climbers who get there, can hand over hand past that blank section. And then up into what was called the flats, which was not the flats at all, but was where the wall went in like this. Underneath ledges, a series of overhangs and ledges that are beneath the dance platform, and we traversed across that and reached the dance platform. And we had no water, we had no more food, and so we weren't going to climb the rest of the Grand Wall. We just didn't have the resources to do it, but we pretty well, I don't say blown our fuses, but we thought we'd done enough and had the sense to crawl off the ledge and go home. And I can remember late in the evening you have to go up to gain the trail on the backside of the Chief. You actually have to continue and more or less get to the top of the Chief to pick up the access down onto the trail. And going up, we were climbing these mossy cracks on the south or east face of the thing, and the moss had moisture in it, and we were so desperate for water that we were pulling out fistfuls of this moss and trying to squeeze water out of it. And of course you couldn't, but we were trying to suck it. And when I told my dad this story, he went down to the paper and dictated a little story to some reporter who put a story in the paper about a couple of kids climbing the thing, and the headline included the byline or whatever you call it. It said "sucked moss," you know. So not only was that sort of the first experience of doing something that gave us some notoriety, but it also wound up with us in the paper, which is a bit of a buzz, you know, kind of a tiny little early taste of some kind of fame. I mean, we're old enough to know that. And anyway, as things went on, within a year, we were looking to have the experience again, only this time the obvious thing to do was to try and do our own thing. And in between, I should add that Fred Becky, who was a regular at Squamish, he had his various peepholes around North America, and Squamish was one of them. I mean, there would be Squamish, and then there would be somewhere in Nevada, then there would be somewhere in California, and then there would be somewhere in the Cascades, of course. And one of the things that Fred cooked up was the first ascent of a route called the Northwest Passage with 3 other very strong climbers. And these were guys that were older than us and way more experienced than us. And they put together this route. And when they were reaching the top, I was actually approached, because of my connection with the paper, through my dad. Reporters called me and said, "Can you take us out there and show us what these guys are doing?" And they hired a helicopter. And got my first helicopter ride was to fly out to Squamish and land on the top, on ledges on the top, and then to guide a photographer down onto ledges near the break-off, near the face, where Fred and Alex Bertulis and
Bjornstad?
Eric Bjornstad, and my closest friends, I forget their names first, and it was Leif Patterson, were the 4. And we took pictures of them coming up the last bit, and we took pictures of them from the air that made it into a newspaper article.
Yeah.
And probably, maybe there's about a year there, and then a few of us decided to take another run at the Chief, and we had spotted a line, and we were looking for a natural line, of course, and the natural line which stood out was the route that became the University Wall. And the University Wall was a vertical corner line, so it was kind of obvious. And we went up and started from the foot of the face and climbed up what amounts to across the apron and arrived at the ledge that people often climb up and across to get to the start, to the Grand Wall, if they don't want to climb the first couple of easy pitches at the bottom. They walk around that and then climb up the slabs towards the split pillar and stuff like that. Well, we actually climbed directly up to there and connected with the corner line and began nailing. And this happened to be in the late summer or fall, and we made it a very short way. We got into this slightly overhanging dihedral, and this was serious nailing in those days, and it was at our limits. And of course the climbers there were Hamish Much and Dan Tate and Glenn Woodsworth. I think Dan and I nailed the first steep bit, which was probably about a half a rope length. We reached a point in this overhanging dihedral where we fixed an anchor, we fixed the station, and rappelled out. And when you rappelled off of the anchor, like I remember, I think Glenn was there. I'm not sure. You'd have to ask him who was on that first key day. But the second came up. Might have been me seconding. I'm not sure. In any case, the pins came out a little too easily, and what was happening again was some exfoliation. So here we were on this overhanging section, and the pins are, you barely step on them and they'd start to shift, and so you'd reach past them and reach to the next one, and that one would pull out and that sort of thing. And it made you wonder about the trustworthiness of the station itself. And there were, I'm sure we had like 6 pitons in the station. We were so scared. And we rappelled off of those, rather, you weren't going to down climb it or anything, rappelled off, and the rappel was a total free rappel back to this tree ledge, and we went home. And that was it for that year. So we basically had all winter to agonize over this, how dangerous or how scary this was going to be to go back there. And to be honest, I remember I made myself sick with worry. I wasn't sure I had the guts to go back and prusik up these ropes, which prusiking is what you did in those days. There weren't any Jumars. You prusik with three slings and so on. But I did go back and did prusik up to that station. And it was one of the first experiences in my life where I can remember very distinctly staring at a situation that if it was as bad as I thought it could be, you might kill yourself. But I still had the ambition to go ahead, to take the chance. And I don't know why I had any reason to know why that station would stay there. And of course, nowadays it wouldn't be any big deal, but in those days we just simply didn't know. And I don't know how good our piton work was in any case, but I'm saying that I remember prusiking up this rope, and it was absolutely breathtakingly scary all the way until we got there. And then somebody else had to come up and add his weight to the station, and then we carried on climbing. And the climbing was very, very slow. And I think, we thought we were, out there. We were doing something pretty extraordinary, pretty tough. It took us not one but several days to make it from that station up to the tree, which is the first real relief on that, which probably in terms of modern rope lengths, like 50-meter ropes, is, I wouldn't be surprised if it's only 2 rope lengths to the tree. But as they say, it took us a couple of days, I think, of work to do that. Anyway, we finished the climb of the university wall, which really the new climbing that we were doing was ended at the dance platform, and we started it the next spring and worked on it, and we would go out 2 at a time for a day or whatever and add another half a rope length sometimes. By the time you'd driven out, hiked up there, prusiked all the way up these ropes and got yourself together, you'd climb another half a rope length or something like that, or maybe a rope length, and shorter ropes, 120 foot ropes, not get anywhere. It took most of the spring to get us into a position where we were ready to really take off, and there were 4 of us had evolved into the team, and the day for the big push happened to be my last day of exams at UBC that year, and I had to go out to university in the morning and write an exam, and then came out of that and immediately left because 2 people had already left to push off, and I forget who it was. I think it was Hamish and Dan, and Glenn Woodsworth and I think came out in the afternoon, and they were so far up they couldn't even hear us. We basically arrived in late afternoon by the time we got our gear together and drove out there. So we were following them up. They left a trail of fixed ropes, and we were following up these fixed ropes, and the idea was to cut them loose and drop them off as we were finished with them, or coil up a few of them and bring them. And so we were whatever, cutting the line behind us or casting off, and I remember prosecuting into the pitch black, and we weren't going to make it up to the dance platform, and we knew that they had made it there. We could see them from the road that they were close to getting there, and we were pretty sure that they had made it before dark. And we bivouacked, lying on some tiny grass ledges up in the little overhangs underneath the dance platform, and hollered for them to, shine a light down or something, but they never did hear us. It was interesting. The sound was such. And we caught up with them the next morning, and they were quite surprised that we had been, sort of just around the corner. And that day, we continued to climb up the line of the original Grand Wall route, up the famous Roman chimneys. And so we were in the position that we in fact did the second ascent of the Roman chimneys, which was really kind of a treat for me, to kind of connect it with the earlier part, or the second ascent of the rest of the wall. And the Roman chimneys were fantastic. They are a spectacular, I call it architecture in rock. You climb up into a big square open chimney that's dead vertical with overhangs in it and stuff, and it was a dramatic and a terrific place to be. And it wasn't just Dan and myself, but now we had Glenn and Hamish, who were both in our view real climbers. They were older than us, and so it was a big treat to get to the top. And we were again really thirsty. It was incredible how we hadn't learned to take more water. But that kind of set me up that for the feeling that wall climbing was where it was at in my youth, in my era. And of course the stories in the American Alpine Journal were really these fabulous pictures of these absolutely clean and sheer and vertical, near vertical or overhanging granite walls that were just enormous. And these guys were doing the sorts of things that we were doing, but they were doing them in spades. And obviously we had to get there, The sort of structure behind the climbing scene was there was the Alpine Club, and there was the BCMC, the British Columbia Mountaineering Club. And a lot of people were in both. And that was true, I think, of the Wisnickis. And through the Wisnickis, the people that we tended to meet on the trips to Squamish were more the BCMCers. And in fact, what was evolving was there was what was called a junior section of the BCMC. If you were under 18 years of age or something like that, you could probably call the junior section so you didn't have to pay so much. But the junior section was people like, I think, not only Glenn and Bob and Arnold Shives and the Woodsworths and Tony Ellis and of course Dick Culbert. I don't know if Dick was young enough to be in the junior section, but we were like a little mini club within a club very quickly. It just evolved that way. And I remember like Martin and Esther Kafer became kind of the godparents of the junior section, because they accompanied us on a couple of weekend trips, and they were sort of maybe the chaperones, I don't know, something like that. But we did some road trips. I remember we went to Pavilion Lake up in the north of north of Ashcroft or places like that, and we made a few mountaineering trips. I mean, it was amazing how, I wouldn't say I was not interested in mountaineering, but I was more interested in the rock climbing. And so being surrounded, I've never climbed myself. I've never climbed like Garibaldi, and I've never been to like Lovely Water or anything like that. And they were right there. I remember a couple of early trips to up above the mine, the copper mine at Britannia Beach. Mm-hmm. So I forget what the names of the peaks are in there, Ledge Mountain or something like that. And I remember one spectacular lightning storm. My first camp out, and it was just a stupendous night for a kid. I mean, you could have just gone and slept out in the meadow in a little tent, which is exactly what we did. But we were hit by a wild storm, a lightning storm, and it started 20 miles away and just kept coming closer and closer and closer. And finally, there was lightning, obviously, that was within yards of us, because the tent was being moved by the compression of the thunder noise. So I mean, we really had sort of seen God. It was interesting times, but we weren't into pubs. We were too young for that, really. And the deal was you went climbing. You brought your jug of orange juice or whatever, and you went for the day. And then the adventure was somebody discovered trips to the Pashasna Pinnacles and into the Wenatchee area, and that became, for a few years, a tradition with us. And we were taken off as youngsters, old enough. Somebody was old enough to drive, and you made the stop over at the co-op in Seattle and tried to find some real climbing equipment, and a decent sleeping bag and this and that. And then you headed across Stevens Pass, I think it was, and down into Tumwater Canyon and go climbing on Castle Rock. And we were climbing at Pashasna Pinnacles in an era that is long since gone, but of course it seems like yesterday, when you not only did you walk up through the orchards, you drove your car right through the orchards and camped in amongst the apple trees. And the farmers didn't seem to mind at that time. And I could remember being kind of amazed at this, that we had such freedom on this people's property, and that nobody seemed to mind. And you wondered whether you should eat the apples, but there were so many around that you could pick them up off the ground. Nobody cared. And I mean, we didn't trash the place or anything like that, but it was a few years after we left that bubble burst.
Yeah.
And but those are terrific times, and hanging out with just a gang of guys climbing on sandstone, and we climbed the trigger finger before it fell down, and I can't remember what it is, Mars Rock and stuff like that. I never actually got to what was obviously way better climbing over on what is it?
Snow Creek Wall.
Snow Creek Wall, which is just a few miles away. And you'd eat in the restaurants in Wenatchee and places like that. I'm quite aware of the fact that I'm talking mostly about me, and want to remind the record that I was, only one thread, and in fact not a particularly productive thread compared to a lot of my friends. Like what the scene was doing at the time was getting out in the mountains all the time, and whole summers were devoted to what amounted to incredible peak bagging expeditions, and they will tell you about their obtaining these grants, these grub stakes from the government to go out and prospect and bring back mineral stuff, and how mineral knowledge, and that was what basically got them into ranges that some of which probably haven't been visited since they were there. But this was going on around me, and I was aware that it was happening. I can remember doing some innocent stuff like packing for, there was an expedition out of Vancouver that went to the Himalayas. I can't remember where it went. You probably remember.
Yes.
The name is just off the tip of my...
Sangre Marmar.
Yeah, and we packed food boxes for that expedition in Peter Thompson's basement. There's another name that I haven't mentioned, Peter Thompson. And Peter Thompson, I can remember, was on a climbing trip. They actually went to Mount Logan. I mean, that was getting your act together, and I just wasn't into, or didn't know how to get involved and get that together. I guess I was doing other things, but off they went to Logan, and the stopper on Logan was incredible snowfalls, and they were following some ridge, and I believe it was on the north side of Logan, over closer to the King Trench, whatever would be in there, when there was so much snow that they were literally shoveling a trench up the crest of this ridge, and started slightly out onto a face, and as the story went, the slope fractured and carried two of them off down the face towards a certain death, except that the rope between them hung up over a boulder that stuck out of the slope. And when that happened, that was enough to wise them up to the fact that they were playing with forces that they didn't understand, and they bagged the trip there and came home. But I can remember that, and that was my first ever knowledge of the idea of slab avalanches. I mean, everybody had heard of snow and loose snow and avalanches and so on, but didn't really understand it. In fact, one of the early fatalities that I can recall, there was a mountaineering fatality that affected someone who we knew from the BCMC, and it was a guy who was leading a rather innocent trip, a ski trip in the wintertime, and he got caught in a gully, a train trap, when the side of the gully let go. And I don't mean a steep gully, I mean like a horizontal creek kind of a gully. And the Kafers would remember well who that was and so on. But that was the first time that somebody who we knew had actually died, and then I could start to relate to that part of the experience as well, that mountaineering is really a blood sport, And so there were a lot of other things happening around, and the climbing scene certainly wasn't limited to the few people that I managed to name. But in terms of the younger people climbing at Squamish, it really was not much more than a handful of people. I mean, Al Midnight and Les had long since gone, and the only other sort of serious regular visitor was Fred Becky himself, and so we were kind of it. But there were probably 15 or 20 people. We knew most of the names, and you got used to seeing them. And this kind of things that we had in common was in the evenings we were stuck in the city, and there's relatively few places to go bouldering around Vancouver. There was the rock quarry in North Vancouver, which was a bit of a drive, and it had a little rock about the size of this room, a cliff about twice the height of this room, that Wade Chernikoff, I remember, climbed, and I'm sure it's 5'10", and I know he did it in literally Oxford street shoes in the early 60s, just for whoever wants to know. And that's the kind of things that you did, and we went down and climbed Siwash Rock, and we climbed buildings at UBC. There was our Bible became Night Climbers at Cambridge, and the other book, The Ascent of Rum Doodle, became our Bibles by defining the humor of climbing, and it immediately took off with us, and we were climbing all the buildings there, as many as we could at UBC. And when we ran out of buildings to climb, and it wasn't like the kind of Grecian architecture or classical architecture of Oxford or Cambridge. It was modern buildings and stucco and bullshit like that. Well, of course, I had some experience with that. And but when we ran out of buildings, we started lifting the hatches on the underwater or the underground drainage system of the university, and basically exploring sewers and stuff. We'd do anything for some kind of natural excitement if we didn't have trying to drive to Squamish, because that was the nearest place to really do anything. But I think I've talked enough about that. One other thing that I should just mention, and that was that one evening activity that came up periodically throughout the year was a number of us joined what was called then the Civil Defense, and formed a thing called the Mountain Rescue Group in Vancouver, and we would go to the basement of the Civil Defense buildings in Kitsilano, where we were provided with a space to do a little bit of training, and one of our older members would come in, and we would practice making a stretcher with a rope, and how to lace somebody up and carry them around, and how to do a split coil carry and carry somebody piggyback fashion on your backs and things like that. And we even worked up a rescue demonstration one time to try and raise some money by putting on a demonstration out at the Chief on the bolt ladder up to the base of the pillar, and we put an ad in the paper and so on. But mostly it was just for our own entertainment, to do that kind of thing and get out and have some fun.
Yeah.
I went on one or two rescues though, just as a kid and as a part of this group. I remember going out one night basically in a blizzard to head up towards the lions to look for somebody, and they were eventually found. I can't remember what the story was there. And off one time to search for somebody on Mount Baker, and they turned up dead in a creek somewhere. And one time went to, of all places, I forget, I guess it's Burnaby Mountain, if that's where Simon Fraser University is located now.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a dirty, slimy sand bluff in the forest behind the university, and some kid had fallen off this thing and been killed. And that was the first time I had actually seen a body, a dead person up close. Kind of remember that experience too. Of course, we're going through the university years in 64, 60, 68, and that's when I was climbing, and also to just sort of jump right ahead, that's when you and Jerry showed up in Vancouver to go to University of British Columbia, and you guys must have wandered into, something that I forgot was at the university at UBC there was the Varsity Outdoor Club, which took over from the sort of BCMC when I reached university. The Varsity Outdoor Club was had one important asset, and that was it had a club room in one of these old Army Quonset buildings that were still hanging around from the Second World War on the university campus. And a row of these huts had been divided into club rooms for, like the Japanese Canadian Club and this and that, and here was the Varsity Outdoor Club. And it was kind of a daily flophouse. It was a place that you didn't have to go to the cafeteria to sit down. You went to your own clubhouse. It was perfect, and it was full of people of all my friends, all like mine. So that was the scene, was the Varsity Outdoor Club. And the trips to Squamish from then on started from there.
Yeah.
And what was I going to say about that? Where was I heading? Oh, yeah.
Well, how did you move beyond into the greater world of mountains?
Well, that's right. I mean, you guys must have darkened the door of the Varsity Outdoor Club just to see who was around. And I would have jumped up to meet you, because I can't remember exactly why, but I mean, I was just enough awake to read the Alpine Journal and so on, and to have picked up on the fact that there was another climbing scene happening on the other side of the Rockies and in Calgary and so on, and so I was familiar with your name and Jerry's name before you arrived, so that when you did arrive, it was like, meeting some friends. And there was a couple of other names, of course. There was Donnie and Charlie Locke and Brian and all that, and I was vaguely aware of these guys, and you were the connection with that, and you guys were more serious students too. I mean, Jerry robbed the bookstore blind out of a passion for reading, and we explored a lot of things, in our evenings in those days, which is what students will do, and it was probably Jerry who, like my summer jobs in the university era, were a couple of them were disasters. I mean, my father talked to some friend and got me a summer job working in a plywood mill in Vancouver, and I did that for about 8 weeks, literally punching a clock and working on dryers and then green chains in there, which is grueling work. I mean, just awesomely boring work, and it taught me the obvious thing that maybe was the number one intention of my father, which is you don't want to do this. But that basically wasted a couple of summers. The days off, I was instantly at Squamish, after during that, and I was able to buy a car or something like that and get around. But one summer was geologizing. I finally got smart and tried to get a geology job, which is what a lot of the other guys in the Varsity Outdoor Club did, because it got you out in the mountains. Well, I signed up with Anaconda to do some dirt sampling, some silt sampling, and wound up in the what do they call it, the plateau country north of Kamloops, where all the fishing camps are, and it's rolling, tree-colored, swampy stuff, with a kind of world-class mosquito population, and not a rock for within 100 miles. And that was my geology experience. But I was tied up with a girlfriend at that time, and the big things that we did were the all-night drives to get back to Vancouver, so you could have a couple of days off with visit your girlfriend and stuff like that. So that was a bit of a bust. I wasn't making peak bagging like Glenn and Dick. And along comes you guys, and it was Jerry Walshu turned me on to the fact that, well, if I was really hard up for a summer job, I should apply for maybe a trail crew job in the national parks. And that was an idea that was just brilliant and hadn't occurred to me because I had no imagination in that department. So 1967, I followed Jerry out to Yoho National Park, and Jerry went with the intention of getting and got a lookoutman's job, and took his packs full of books up to Hunter Ridge Lookout and spent the summer there. Hunter or Talker, I think he started in Hunter and went to Talker Ridge, which the wardens all know where these places are. And I worked in the trail crew and looked around the Rockies, and one thing I had heard of through the Wisnickis was Lake O'Hara, and I'd even heard the name of the plum of Lake O'Hara, which was of course Mount Hungabi. And so at some point on a day off, I made it up to Lake O'Hara and discovered this spectacular paradise of real mountains. I mean, mountains that look like mountains and are up close and have rock and snow and ice and all that. And so at the end of the summer season in 1967, when I was laid off, my plan was to make at least a short trip to Lake O'Hara before I went back to school. And the warden in residence at the cabin at Lake O'Hara, the young warden at the time was Sid Marty. And I chatted up Sid, and turned out that he was quite interested in getting up a mountain, and I don't know, somehow he fell in with my energy, and we made plans and climbed Mount Hungabi. So we're at Lake O'Hara, and it's the end of the summer climbing season in September of 1967, and I just climbed Mount Hungabi with Sid Marty, which was a treat, and it really was, in a lot of respects, was my first really high peak and an enjoyable thing. And suddenly I discovered, hey, climbing mountains is almost as much fun as rock climbing. We came down, and then I set my sights on the rock climb in Lake O'Hara, which of course is the grassy ridge. And Sid was not that keen on it, but I needed a partner and I had to do it. And I mean, it was just the thing to do. So one thing led to another, and managed to persuade him to go with me that day. But there were 2 ropes already on the climb ahead of us, and I just remember one of the names. I remember the other people, but I can't remember their names. But one of them was Peter Spear from Calgary, and these 2 ropes had got up there and got the jump on us, so we fell in behind them. And about after the first step and starting up the next steepish stuff. The woman on the end of the first rope is climbing along. She's following. She's seconding, and I think it's Peter is climbing right behind her, so that he's fairly safe from whatever she dislodges, leading the second rope. But in fact, she managed to dislodge a good sized, a small suitcase sized block, which fell straight down and crushed the side of Peter's foot. In fact, he was wearing leather climbing boots, and it crushed the side so that the boot was wide open, and of course bloodied his foot pretty badly. And so there we were with a climbing accident right in our faces, and Sid was there, and we looked at each other and said, "Gee, I mean, what do we do here?" And I said, "Well, I've got an idea. I mean, I know how to do a split rope carry. And the best thing would be to put it on you, Sid, because Sid is a big guy." And we loaded Peter on Sid's back and gave him a bit of a back rope, and I went snooping around and found a way that you could actually weasel off this ledge into the big gully. And we managed to get in there and do a little rope lower down into the bottom of the gully, and then took him down, which was in fact my first rescue for the Park Service, and I wasn't even working for them. That was the end of the season. I never did get up the grassy ridge then. I finally had figured, I'm going to grow old and gray if I don't make the effort to get to Yosemite pretty soon here. I mean, the era was winding up. The golden years of Yosemite were in fact winding up, and we're talking 69. But I wanted to go there, and there were several others, and Gordy Smale and Neil Bennett and Steve Sutton and Hugh Burton they had hit the climbing scene in Squamish, and they were happening. And anyway, I in the spring of 69, I finally set sail and bought the bus ticket and went to California to visit somebody that I knew in Berkeley, and part of the purpose of the trip was to get up to Yosemite and actually see the place. And so after a few days in Berkeley, a friend of mine had a pickup truck, and we all loaded in it, and we drove up and into Yosemite, and we arrived in the evening, and of course had the original view, or first view, which blew my doors right off. And it's a fabulous place, and the camping is wonderful, and the moonlight was full and bathed the valley at night, and the smell of the campfire smoke was just fine, thank you very much. And the very first night that I was there, Gordy Smale and Neil Bennett happened to drift by, and they had just arrived that very day too, and it was like magic, the Canadians had arrived. And I remember sleeping under the tailgate of this guy's truck in the moonlight, and waking up in the middle of the night because a dog was barking in the next campsite, and the dog had treed the campground bear that came through to clean up the dishes. It treed this bear about 20 feet from me, and it was the same tree that the dog's owner had his tent tied to. There was sort of mass confusion that just made you roll over and go back to sleep and say, "This is wonderful, what a place." And so we did 3 or 4 days of climbing, and it sounds amazing that it would only be 3 or 4 days, but what I had in my back pocket was a letter from Yoho National Park in answer to my application for a job in the park, because I couldn't figure out what to do with myself. I was now graduated from UBC and didn't have a clue what I was going to do with my life. But I was just starting to do at least a little bit of wandering and a little bit of fun, but I knew I was going to need some money. I knew I was going to need a job. And so I had this reply from Yoho Park saying, "Yes, you're accepted back on the trail crew." And I had also asked if I said, and oh, by the way, sort of a PS to this letter, if you need somebody for the position up at Lake O'Hara, the one that had been Sid Marty's job, if he had gone, I said I'd be interested in doing it. And for the first time in entire life, sat down in that letter and wrote a paragraph that kind of tooted my own horn. It said, you know, well, I mean, I've worked for the civil defense and a little bit about mountain rescue, and then I said some things I knew they'd want to hear about being a friendly kind of outgoing kind of a guy, and that I think I could talk to the public and this and that. And the letter that came back just before I left, I mean, more or less the day that I was leaving for Yosemite the first time, said, and yes, we will consider you for the job at Lake O'Hara. It didn't say I had it, but it said we will consider you for that job. And so here I was confronted with, I mean, I'd never been very good at getting jobs and pushing myself, but I had a job offer to go back to the park, which was a sure thing, and maybe an opportunity to be the warden there too. And I thought, I mean, this is like being given the keys to paradise. So after like 5 days in Yosemite, I mean, we climbed some of the routes at the foot of El Cap. Remember, we climbed the direct route on Washington Column, which is a chimney route. It's a classic chimney route. And one or two other things. I had to make the decision, am I going to go back? There was a deadline to get back there. And I had to go. I pulled the plug and I went back to Canada, and I went up to Yoho, got back on the trail crew, and about 2 weeks later, when we were coming home one evening in the truck back to the compound, we were living in a bunkhouse, and the chief warden came wandering over and said, Tim, if you still want that job at Lake O'Hara, we need somebody up there. And so bingo, I arrived, you know. And the very next day, I went to town and I bought a couple of boxes of groceries and packed my stuff in this bunkhouse. And the chief warden, whose name was Neil Woolidge, loaded me in his car and drove me up the O'Hara Road and took me into the O'Hara warden cabin, which was going to be my home in the summertime for the next 6 years. I mean, of course, I didn't know that at the time, but it was going to be my home. And I mean, the place is got to be one of the most wonderful places in the world. And I had a log cabin there, and I remember him sitting on the picnic table, or at the picnic table, which was the kitchen dining room table in the cabin at the time, and just talking to me quietly about what my job was supposed to be up there. I was supposed to basically just look after the place, clean up the trails a little bit, make sure that the garbage was collected, make sure there was toilet paper, you know, just the stuff that had to be done, parky kind of things that all made perfect sense to me. And he gave me one instruction, was he told me I should go over and meet Dr. Link, who was a retired professor who had been visiting Lake O'Hara for so many years that the chief warden couldn't remember, but he knew everything that you needed to know about what needed doing at Lake O'Hara, and I should just go and introduce myself to him and make friends with him, which I did, and it was the start of a wonderful relationship with a very, very elderly and very interesting man. And I remember him sitting there with a pocket knife and making a, forget what you call a swizzle stick, or, you know, basically
fuzz stick.
A fuzz stick, not a swizzle stick, and making a fuzz stick, and to sort of show me how it was done to start the stove, because he knew I was a city boy, and I probably I'd stagger around and burn a whole lot of newspaper trying to do it. But anyway, he finally left me alone and in the cabin to put my stuff away, and drove off down, and Lake O'Hara was mine. And at 6 or 5:30 in the evening, while I'm still sort of stocking the shelves, there's a knock at the door, and it's my first public inquiry. And I go to the door and I open it up. I've got a warden shirt, which is no flashes, I don't think, just a shirt with the epaulets and blue jeans. And it turns out this is a climber, and he's a young Brit. He's a little bit older than me, and he's traveling. And he says, do you know anything about the climbing around here? And he said, well, I'm not sure. I know a little bit. And I stepped out in the front, and he said, well, are there any good rock climbs? And I took him around the corner of the building, and I pointed, and I said, well, the only one I know about is Grassy Ridge, and it's that ridge right there. And he said, well, do you know anybody who wants to do it? And I said, yeah, I think I do. I'd like to do it. And he said, well, okay, well, when would you like to do it? And I said, well, how'd you like to go right now? So he ran back up to the alpine meadows, and he grabbed a rope, and in his rock shoes, and he came back down, and at 6 o'clock we took off, and we climbed the grassy ridge, and we finished it at 10 o'clock at night. I'd been there for 2 hours, and I'd done my first climb. I mean, it was unfinished business, and I'll never forget that. And I worked in Lake O'Hara, in Yoho Park, as I say, for 6 consecutive years. And things changed every year a little bit in terms of the way the park was organized and stuff, but I was always there. I mean, I shared it sometimes with other people, including a guy named Yanis Kraulis, who's become a very famous photographer, person who sells books of mountain photographs, and Rick Cornelius, and the story about Rick is Rick was the night watch, or the night desk clerk at Wapta Lodge, down, of course, at the foot of the O'Hara Road. And the connection is of course, that Rick Cornelius' sister was Jerry Walsh's girlfriend from years before, and so I somehow come to know Rick. A really interesting guy, and the chief warden at one point mentioned that they may need somebody else to do some particular job. They were looking for somebody to hire, and did I happen to know anybody? I said, well, yeah, actually, matter of fact, I think I might know somebody who would need a job. And I went down and said, Rick, do you want a park job? I mean, there's something happening here. And the next day he went down and got signed up, and he ended up staying with me at Lake O'Hara. And the only reason why I mention this is because a year or two after this, Rick, the chief warden, the original chief warden changed, and the new chief warden came as Andy Anderson. And Rick made pals with Andy, and when Andy took a promotion from being the chief warden of Yoho Park to the chief warden of Banff Park, Rick followed him over to Banff. And a year later, I had this seasonal park job, and as one of the kind of Hottentots from the Calgary regional office explained, after 3 or 4 years, he put his arm around my shoulders and said, you can't be a seasonal warden forever, son. And it was, I thought what he was saying is you'll have to grow up and take a full-time job. And what he might have actually, in all honesty, been saying is you're plugging this position. We use them as a kind of introduction to the warden service. We don't want people who want to be, work for 4 months of the year for the rest of their lives. But anyway, that's exactly what I did for a few years. And I don't know whether he helped engineer it, but a few serious job offers came in over the years. And I remember one happened one day when I had reached the point where, being the avid climber in the group, I'd become a kind of a de facto public safety guy for Yoho Park, and I was giving a climbing school. And I'm a seasonal warden, and I'm teaching the older guys what to do. But anyway, it all made sense. But here we are standing out on this cliff down in the south end of the park, and over the radio I get a call, and it's the chief warden calling to say that they've offered me a job in Jasper. It's 10 o'clock in the morning, and he's radioing me to say, do you want a job in Jasper, a permanent job? And you got to make up your mind like now. You got 5 minutes to make up your mind. And I said, well, if I've got 5 minutes, my answer is no thanks. I like what I'm doing. I like it here. I don't know what Jasper's like, and I don't want to go somewhere as quiet as that and off the beaten track. So, hardly off the beaten track. But I just kept turning down jobs because I knew what I liked doing and was doing. And I was, at that time, by then I was going back to Yosemite. I'll finish that story, and that'll probably be it for tonight. But I went, I turned down these jobs until 1974 or 5, when, in fact, what was going on in Banff was the public safety business had just gone up a giant notch. It was just, things had gotten very, very busy, and the warden service was just getting run ragged, taken off every other day doing some kind of a rescue or a mountain rescue. And Andy Anderson said, we should think of some other way of doing this. And they came up with the idea, I think maybe him and Rick hatched the idea of possibly there should be something like a specialist team of wardens, that it was, things were getting beyond the stage where the alpine specialist could do it all and just sort of take a warden with them and they go out and do it the way Walter Perrin used to do and Peter Furman. And they hatched the idea of a public safety team and of wardens who really wanted that kind of work, because there was, in truth, there were amongst the wardens, there were guys who were pretty reluctant mountaineers. I mean, they came from the ranches and they were the horsemen and so on, and there were some of them who took to it naturally, and some of them thought this was definitely, another world, and they could kind of live without it. Anyway, Rick suggested to Andy that maybe I would be one of the people that would be suitable for a public safety team, and the offer was made, and that's when I finally looked down the well and realized it was, if I was going to make the move ever, this was it. And something told me that the action was going to be based out of Banff if it was anywhere, and so I took the job, and I've been there ever since.
Yeah.
Well, let me go back to my first summer as a warden at Lake O'Hara, and of course it was a brilliant summer. It was a fabulous experience, and I did just exactly what I said. I went around and I picked up cigarette butts. I babied the place. I loved it. And the people that came were all kinds of people. They were, professional people, and they were people that piled off the bus to go fishing, and I just did whatever it was that would make people want me to be there. And I swept out the picnic shelters every week, and I painted the inside of the outhouses and stuff like that. I mean, that's what needed doing, and I felt that was the job, and climbed a lot. So I climbed everything in Lake O'Hara. Bernie Schiesser's camp was there, with High Horizons Camp, which was a kids' camp. And I remember Charlie Locke showed up, and Doug Lamond was there, and we suggested to Bernie that we would each take a kid and go climb the Tarrant Route on Oderay. We did it. I mean, okay. And I had a good day at it as well. It was really an adventure, but I mean, you could have probably told Bernie you'd do anything, and he's okay. But we, at the end of the summer, I mean, there were no spectacular climbs or anything. It was just enjoying the place. And at the end of that summer, sort of the second week of September, I was laid off for the season, because in those days O'Hara really did shut right up. And there was even being the first snow. I mean, sometimes you get a little bit of snow out there in the first week of September or so. Anyway, I can remember extremely well the ride down the road at the end of the season, and I literally had a lump in my throat. I think I had tears in the corner of my eyes as I looked out of the window up at the face of Wawaxie going by, wondering if I would ever come back to this place. It was absolutely nirvana, But of course, where I was going was Yosemite. And over the course of that summer, remember I mentioned that Neil Bennett and Gordy Smale had arrived there. Well, they stayed, and they climbed. And I would get these postcards about every other week saying, well, we just did such and such, and it was the South Face of Washington column, and then it was the Chenard Herbert on Sentinel, and then it was the Harding Route on the Leaning Tower, and then it was something called the North Face of the Rostrum, and on, And each time one of these letters came, or postcards came, I would read it, and it would be like a little, stab in my heart that these guys had, there's the first Canadian ascent of this, and this, and this, and they were obviously having a wonderful time too. And so I set my sights on catching up with them. And my friend Mike Woznicki was getting interested in this, and he married, and he and Beverly were going to drive to Yosemite, and I was going to meet these guys down there, and so that's what I did. And I got to Yosemite, and the sun was still hot. And, just before I left, late August, comes the ultimate, and it's the letter. I open it up, and Gordy and Neil have climbed the nose, which is, that would have been a relatively early ascent of the nose route, probably at least in the first dozen ascents, and these guys had climbed it, and I went, oh God, it really was hard. It's almost heartbreaking, but it was wonderful, So I tore off down there and caught up with them, and with my old pal Mike, the first thing we did was we jumped straight to the south face of Washington Column and knocked that off in a day and a half with a bivouac, and had a really neat time. One day off, sort of lounging by the Merced River, and the next route was the route on the rostrum, which I was going to climb with Neil Bennett. And we got 3 pitches up that, and we came to this place where the route description said you traverse over and you climb this chimney. And I looked at this chimney, and this was like a 3-story stairwell or a 4-story stairwell with no bottom to it, like 3 pitches off the ground, and a stairwell with no stairs in it. I mean, it was a square side. It was like the Roman chimneys all over again. And you thought, God, I mean, this is a totally unprotected chimney for what looked like 90 feet. And right up above me was this crack that was about this wide and behind a flake. And it was sort of a perfect kind of lie-back jam crack thing. So I told Neil, why don't we try this? And it goes up, and it curved over, and it looked like it would get easier towards the top, and it would intersect the same place. So off I went, and I climbed up a little ways and found a decent place to jam, and I knocked in a 2 or 3 inch angle and stood on it and rested, and then I reached high up and put in another pin, and climbed up, and then stood on it and reached up and put in another pin, and these are spaced about 8 or 10 feet apart almost, or whatever I could reach. And then after doing this 2 or 3 times, I thought, okay, now I'm about halfway up this thing. If I get really bold, I can free climb to the top of it. And but just in case, I got a 2 inch angle out, and I put a sling on it, and I put it in my teeth, so it would be really handy. And off I went, kind of lie back and jamming up this thing. And before it started to ease over like this, where I thought it's going to turn into something like this, and it'd be a hand traverse, and an easy hand traverse, I realized that my arms were getting a little tired. And I had that 1 split second of weakness and indecision. And that was the one where you go, uh-oh, maybe I don't have the strength to do this. I'm losing my arms here. And rather than go higher, I should stop and put something in, which I tried to do. So hanging on with one hand, I take the handy pin and I stick it in. And of course, it's just about a half size too small, and it goes into the crack and rattles down inside it like that. And I go, oh shit. So I warn him that I'm getting tired, and I tried to start climbing back down, because I didn't have the strength to get another pin off my rack or anything, and let go, actually my feet came off and I slipped down. And I clipped a little ledge on the way by, and I broke a bone inside my ankle. And I ended up with my first morphine experience that evening. Mike was a ski patroller, and he said, one thing for sure, Tim, if they ask you if you hurt, well, yes. But they off down to the clinic, and then it was, they didn't have there. I was sent down to Merced or someplace like that, to the little hospital, and got a cast on my foot, and I was shipped back to Vancouver with Neil and Beverly, and that was the end of my first serious stop in. It was like 4 days after I'd got there. It was this wreck, and I had a cast on my ankle for almost 6 months because of the way they healed in those days, and the medicine, and I couldn't stand. It was not a walking cast either, because of the peculiar, if you break the talus bone, it's a goofy thing. And after that, I mean, here I wind up back in my parents' house, and now I can't remember what I am, I'm 19 or 20 years old, and I'm stuck back in, at home and cannot get out of the nest, So partway through the winter and through trying to kill time with this broken leg, I got bored and I hitchhiked to Calgary with no real plans, but just an idea that there was some kind of culture happening in Calgary, and I'm sure it had a lot to do with you guys and the feeling that I got from you guys, and that I wanted to get over there and just do something different and see something else, and arrived at T-Squared, the Climbers Flophouse on Memorial Drive, and there was a room for me, like it was a room with no furniture. I put a door out of the basement, an old door, on a couple of cement blocks and threw a foamy on it, and painted the walls, because I've always been painting things, as you know, mm-hmm. and set up a nice room, and got a job cleaning films in the university film library, and learned something about partying is what basically what. And when they took the cast off me in March, so it was from September through till March, the end of March, when I got the cast off. The whole point of it was to get the strength back in that leg, and I ended up back in Yosemite that spring. And I visited Yosemite each spring and fall for 4 years, nonstop. So went down basically 8 trips in a row. And on the last trip, or second to last trip, I went down in September after working, in the park, and didn't come home. I stayed there through the winter in Berkeley. So I lived in Berkeley at the tail end of a pretty interesting time in California, and the Vietnam War was going on and that sort of thing, and lived with a friend there, a really good friend named Mike Farrell. Did lots of climbing, and that's when I chummed up with Galen Rowell. In fact, my first encounter with Galen Rowell was in 1969, when I was wardening at Lake O'Hara, and I came into the old clubhouse on Sulphur Mountain on a day off to look and see if there were any climbers there, and lo and behold, here is Fred Becky. Well, I knew Fred Becky, I'd known Fred Becky for 10 years at that point. And I thought maybe I had a climbing partner. Well, he was sort of teamed up for the next day with somebody already, but he said there's this guy, Galen Rowell, is a pal of his, and he probably wants to do something. And so I walked over and introduced myself to Galen and said, you want to go climbing? Sure. And we ended up going out the next morning and climbing Mount Louis, because I had to do Louis. I knew it was there. But we weren't going to do the normal route. Galen took one look and said, well, let's find another line. We'll do something different. And it seemed fine by me. And we climbed a route on the east face of Louis, which, to my knowledge, has never been repeated. Not because it's hard or anything, it's just nobody ever thinks of it. It's just not that big of a deal, but it had some decent rock climbing on it. Mm-hmm. And I can remember coming off the top of Louis, we climbed this route in a few hours. Galen was very powerful, very fast, and I could keep up, and I led my share of stuff, and we ended up on top of Louis, and there was a party of about 5 people or 6 people just leaving the top as we came up and headed over to the top. So we kind of tagged the top or filled our names in the book and then came back along, and the way down was to down climb. For us, the one that made sense was down climb the normal up route, which is the cane route. So we jumped into this chimney and caught up with these people right away, and they were still just sort of half organizing the rappelling down the chimney. And we just literally jumped in. We said, do you mind if we play through? We're not even going to rappel. And we kind of swelled ourselves up like prunes and jumped in the chimney between these guys' legs, slithered down underneath them, and then just rocketed down the chimney and out the bottom and out. And I remember down climbing to the back to our running shoes and tearing out the trail and getting back to the clubhouse in time for the 6 o'clock meal call, which wasn't bad if you consider we're doing a first ascent. That was the first time I was up there, and the whole trip had taken from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night, which is a pretty respectable time. And for years I never beat that time. And I've now climbed Louis something in the order of, I figure, 24 times plus. And I have done it faster than that, but I've only done it faster when I've soloed it and really, put my shorts on and tried to go as hard as I could. And I've done the round trip to the top of Louis in about, the fastest time I ever did was about 4.5 hours from the car door to car door by the Cane route, and that was taking a thin rope and rappelling the backside too. So this year, 1996, I climbed it. I've done Louis a number of times by myself. It's the thing to do to blow the carbs out, the carbon out of the carburetor. When I just take off and go and do it, and did it this year, and I've never done it as fast as the 4.5 hours again, and it's just a sign of my age. I just cannot go that fast, and I'm getting out of shape. But this year I decided to down climb the way I'd done it originally, to see what it was like, and I did it, but you had to be bloody careful to do it, and I thought, well, you weren't that bad in 1969, but in California, on the Californian trips, I climbed, I've never been terribly ambitious, but I knew what I wanted to climb and gradually got around it, but I wasn't like I was beating down the doors. I mean, I knew that there were wonderful things out there, like Patagonia was waiting, and there was unclimbed peaks all over Patagonia, and I could have gone there, or I could have gone to Baffin Island, and never really had the ambition enough to put it together and do those things. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that I had this wonderful job that I just had to go back to in the summer months, So the best climbing season I ever had was bar none, was staying in California over a winter, and climbed a lot with Galen, and had a taste of the desert enough to know that I love it, and climbed things like Keeler Needle in the wintertime. Interestingly enough, did like probably the third ascent of Keeler Needle and the first winter ascent of Keeler Needle, and took Warren Harding along to boot. So it was an interesting time. And I made a trip to Alaska with Galen and another guy. We drove up there and flew into the Ruth Gorge again with Harding to try and get up the Moose's Tooth, and that was a bit of a disaster. We got a fair ways up the thing, but our trip was doomed, and it had a lot to do with Warren being a mess, and us not being unmessed enough that we could really put it together. But anyway, so I meanwhile I'm working parks and running around and climbing a few things in the Rockies. But you know what I did climb mostly in those days? I loved Yamnuska. Yamnuska was fabulous. And I came back I remember the day that you and I went climbing, and I had come back from my best year in that season. And I wound up that season doing things like after Keeler Needle, climbed, actually I should say, that same winter, with my friend Mike Farrell, tried to do a winter ascent, and it would have been the first winter ascent of the Nose. And we tried it in January and made it sort of a day off the ground, and then we turned around because he got sick, he had a cold. And in February we went back again. And I mean, we knew what we were doing. We had good gear and we knew what it was going to take to do it, but we'd made one resolution, and that was that we knew that the Sierras could turn into a real winter. And you did not want to be on El Cap in real winter. You wanted to climb it in the winter season, but you didn't want to climb it in full-on winter conditions. And what we knew about was that the dihedrals would fill with ice, and that this ice would peel off and fall down and kill you. So you didn't want to take chances. And so the moral of how to do it properly was to get the right block of weather and get up to things. So we climbed to Camp 4 on the Nose so we had 2 bivvies, I think 1 or 2 bivvies, and arrived at Camp 4, which would have been like 2 more bivvies to the top on that schedule, and the weather changed on us, and somebody came and hollered from the bottom of the wall, And we went, what? And we finally figured out that they were calling, it's going to snow. And so we woke up in the morning and the clouds were changing and weather was clearly coming in, and we did what we had resolved to do, which was we wrapped off of Camp 4. And it was a classic sort of 4-hour trip to the, it taken us 3 days to get out there. It took us 4 hours to get to the ground, and that was the end of that. I ended up climbing El Cap shortly after, like in April, so it wasn't a winter ascent. With another guy, I went back and climbed what was called the Triple Direct in those days, which, as it happens, climbs the first third of the Salothe wall, kind of climbs the middle third of what was called the Mirror Wall, and it meets up with the nose route at precisely the point where we had turned around. And in fact, we had stashed our supplies, we'd left them there, the prospect that we would come back, we weren't going to carry them down. And we arrived back there, and there was our stuff. So I had an incredible luxury trip up El Cap because we had a reasonably light haul bag, and we had caches along the way, you know. And we made it up. We finished the Triple Direct. I was with a guy named Matt, who, as I recall, was one of the few climbers who was actually born and brought up in Yosemite Valley. His dad ran a store there or something like that. And then back to Canada in the spring, you know. And
somewhere around there, you climbed with Brian a little bit. You did Call Wall with Vokroth, and you did the West Face with Brian.
West Face of El Cap with Brian,
yeah.
And I remember climbing the West Face with him, and it was beautiful. It's a really nice climb. Now, it's not one of the great wall climbs on the front side, but first of all, it was a treat to be climbing with Brian, and second of all, it was in a beautiful place. And the one outstanding experience was in this mellow corner, sort of 2 days off the ground, this long corner that you had to kind of nail up. Halfway up the corner, realized that there was a wasp's nest inside the crack, and you had to pass this place or it was give up the climb, you know. So I drew the lead, you know. I drew the straw for the lead, and I climbed up there, and I climbed it very, very delicately. And I remember how I did it. I talked to the wasps, and I told them I was coming through. I just passing by. I wasn't going to hurt any of them. And I just had to put this piton here, and I'll tap on it very, very gently. And you know, literally, because inside there were hundreds of wasps around, you know, and it could have been a bit of a problem. Anyway, as I climbed past them, they let me go by, but they were fascinated with any color, and the rope was a bright orange or something like that, and I might have had some color on my clothes or something. So these wasps followed me. A bunch of them followed me the rest of the way up the pitch, and at the top of the pitch I set up the station, and I'm being careful to sort of gently flick the ropes because the wasps would land on the ropes, you know, and stuff like this, and not a single sting. And I remember calling down to Brian saying, well, I'm up and the station's ready, and you know, do me a favor, send up your cigarettes, because of course he was a chain smoker in those days, and so he kept a handful so that he could have a smoke, and he climbed by, and neither of us got stung. And I'm sure it's the way we did it, because you could have pissed them off and it would have been a disaster.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about the Call Wall? You did that with Vokroth about that time. Yeah,
around that time. I don't remember the year exactly, but Call Wall was Don's route for sure. And he picked it out. It was his inspiration, and he had already worked about a halfway up the route. You climb up big curving line, and you come out on a traversing terrace, and that's where the steeper stuff starts. That is really kind of the classic set piece Call Wall. And he had worked his way up probably 100 or so feet above that ledge. And he put in some pins, and I think he even put in a bolt or two, and he had backed off. And Don, I remember Don's story of a number of routes that he did on on Yamnuska. Pardon me. They'd kind of gone back a number of times to get up them. You know, him and Lloyd or whoever, you know, that he'd worked with. But so this was not unusual that he would have made it halfway up and then gone down. And anyway, I met him and we hit it off, and he's real friendly. And I had sort of a little bit of a reputation of being a wall guy and a nail-up guy because of Yosemite and things like that. I mean, you knew that about me and so on. And so he kind of enlisted me because he thought that the next part of this thing was going to require some nailing. And it did, a little bit. And that's the stretch that is now the 510A free climbing. There's some bolts there. I don't remember whether I put in any bolts or whether he'd actually reached the point where, in fact, I think he got up to the high bolt and then turned around, and that's where you're basically back into free climbing with the little corners and stuff like that. And I remember leading the pitch that went up and then out and around onto the main gray slabby face. That was all my lead, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful, and I mean, we didn't nail it all. We free climbed parts of it, or a good part of it, but used some aid in those corners. And I remember I did put a bolt in that slab, and the bolt is still there, and it's a roll stud bolt. And I remember putting nuts in sideways in these little water runnels on that gray slab to protect it, because boy, I thought, you're way out. You know, you're way out here, run out. And I still like to climb Call Wall, and of course do it free now. I wasn't inspired enough rock climber, free climber, to have let it free in the first place. But it's neat.
Yeah.
It was his. To just jump back in terms of people who sort of inspired me, because it's on your list, is one person, might be a little unusual, was I ran into Chuck Pratt in Yosemite, and I'd heard of him and I'd read about him, and when I was just being a Squamish climber, but dreaming about going to Yosemite, I mean, I had somewhere got literally a centerfold picture of El Cap, and probably the picture out of one of the American Alpine journals, and taped it to my ceiling like kids do, to dream about it, and looked at the nose and El Cap, and read stories by guys like Robbins and Chenard and so on. And here was this guy, Chuck Pratt. And Chuck Pratt has only written a few things, but you read anything by Chuck Pratt and it's brilliant writing. And anyway, I met him, and he was the only guy from that era that was still hanging around Yosemite, because he just loved climbing. I mean, these other guys, they climbed, they made their mark, or they did their climb, and then, well, it was a done thing, and they went on to do something else, like make $1 million or whatever. And Chuck was more like me. He just wanted to climb and just kept doing it and doing it and doing it. Anyway, I met Chuck, and we hit it off really well, and I enjoyed his company, and he put up with me, and I did some neat climbing with him, and had a couple of wonderful experiences. And one of them was getting to know the guy. He's very personable, and getting to know him well enough fairly early on that I could ask him, figured, I in my day already, I had fallen off things. I pulled a pin on Sentry Box and fallen down into the boulders and not got a bump or a scratch on me. And I thought about falling and stuff like that. So here I am in Yosemite climbing with Chuck Pratt, and asked Chuck, said, Chuck, how far have you fallen? And he didn't really understand the question. He said, well, come on. He tried to put me off. And I go, come on, tell me. I mean, you've done lots of climbing. Yeah, how far have you fallen? He said, I don't know, 5 feet. And I went, no, 5 feet, that's impossible. I mean, I didn't mean that, Chuck. I meant take all your falls and add them together end to end. Tell me how, so to me this was a measure of how much climbing he would have done. And he thought about it for a minute. He's belaying somebody while he's thinking about it. He says, I don't know, 10 feet, 11 feet, something like that. And a bolt of lightning hit me, and that was that Chuck didn't fall. Falling wasn't in the formula. And nobody had ever really told me that in climbing. I just hadn't grown up in a culture of climbing that had even suggested that as a possibility. I'd more grown up, my mind, the formal climbing consciousness began with the white spider, and that was all about, having close brushes with death. That's what climbing was all about. And that was a terrific experience, was realizing that Chuck juggled everything and he climbed in a way. And then I started to watch him, and I saw him climb a few hard things, and Chuck led some, full-on 5'10" flaring chimneys and stuff like that, overhanging flaring chimneys that I then followed. And when I followed them, I tried to imitate what he had done. And he had climbed from a lock position, a brace-supported lock position. And he'd made a few more moves, only when he was perfectly ready. He was the first person that I've climbed with who I went, I get it. Here is a true master. He really was, and he, as far as I know, may still be, a master climber.
Yeah.